the Sacramento area and the Sierra foothills is fascinating and multidimensional. And if you're interested in knowing the whole story, the Chinese experience is a big part of it. It would be hard to find someone local who was better qualified to tell it than Bill George. Bill's been interested in culture, history, and travel for many years, even serving as a tour director in Chicago and working his way through college. He was a television journalist for KCRA here in Sacramento before transitioning to public relations. In 2010, he founded Nimbus Films, and he's produced documentaries about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the town of Newcastle, and tonight's topic, Chinese experience in California. He's the author of Rails, Tales, and Trails, which describe the various locales associated with foothill railroads, and he's the founder of the Golden West Film Festival in Auburn. Please give a Fair Oaks welcome to Bill George.
Thanks, Rick. Well, what a great turnout. You know, it's a little noisier than most of the Rotaries I do, which meet at noon, so I don't know what to attribute to that. But it is Thanksgiving and week, and we all have a lot to give thanks for. And you know, when the gold rush occurred, of course in 1848, not 1849, but in 1848 when gold was discovered, it prompted what many historians call the greatest mass migration of people in the history of the world. Think about that. How many people from all over the world sold off everything they had, ran to the nearest ship, bought whatever supplies they could, and set out for where? Sacramento, California. They weren't going to San Francisco. They were coming here because this was the place where they would jump off to the gold fields, which of course were found right up in Coloma, a few miles outside of Sacramento. It was such a melee, if you will, and so chaotic that there was one story written in the newspaper, and it talked about not an atypical situation. A father had sold everything he had. He was older, his sons were in their 20s and his family, and their cousins, and he sold everything he had. He had property, and he was the only one with money. So he got the money and he financed the whole trip over. You know, they had to come either overland or around the Cape of South America. Whatever way you came, by the time you got here, you were likely to be suffering from disease and starvation, or at least hunger. You were in bad shape. So they plowed into the slough here in Sacramento, scrambled up the embankment, and they left their father basically to die on the embankment. That's the kind of society that was going on. Now, why was that? One of the reasons was because there was such gold fever. There weren't any hospitals. There wasn't a city government. No one would stay and work a job. As soon as they could, they would set out for the gold mine. So they would just leave people literally to die. Now, who stepped into the breach? The service clubs. And not an offense to Rotary, but the club that was there at the time was the Oddfellows. And it was the Oddfellows who set up a hospital on the bank and set up medical facilities and other charitable outreach so that people could at least get a foothold here. So I salute what you do to this day, and you're part of a long, proud tradition here in Sacramento of private groups stepping in to do the work, important work for those who are disadvantaged. So. 8:30, I don't want to go too long. So, what kind of world were people coming into in 1849? Did you know that Sacramento was a city before California was a state? It's true. There was no state government. There was a very limited federal government, which was limited to a couple of kind of ill-disciplined militia groups and a navy. It was open territory. There is no other time in the history of the world where people came from all over the world, went to another country, walked ashore, went out and started pulling valuable metal out of the ground. But that's what happened here. And the Chinese were part of that. In many ways, they were closer than people from Europe and even from the East Coast. So people in Hong Kong went to Hong Kong, the Chinese, and got to California, just like everybody else, on their own free will, to come and find the gold. The Chinese population in California in 1848 was 7. The Chinese population in 1852 was 11,794. Of that number, there were 74 women. So now that wasn't all that unusual, because mainly it was young guys coming here from around the world to try to find their gold and make their fortune. What can you see in Sacramento? So I've done these films. I got interested in it because I wanted to know, what can you still see of history today? What is still there that was built? So for the Central Pacific Railroad, which was my first film, I went and I followed the railroad from Sacramento up over Donner Summit. And it was amazing to me that there's giant granite tunnels up at Donner Summit that you can still walk through that were built, carved out by the Chinese workers. There's a place called Cape Horn where you can walk around and see what that's like. Huge trestles, all kinds of sites that you can still see. So that was my first film. Then I wanted to know, what could you still see of the Chinese experience? And unfortunately in Sacramento, we've really kind of eliminated a lot of what you could still see today. The old Chinatown, which was contiguous to Old Sacramento on I Street, is long gone. You know where the federal building is on I Street? It's that tall federal building that overlooks the railroad depot. They've got a little display in there and you can go in and see. I'd recommend you do it if you're interested at all. But there used to be a large lake around where that building is today. They excavated that site and they came up with some Chinese artifacts. But that's really about it. If you really want to see our Chinese culture, you've got to go to Yuba City, Marysville, and Oroville. The Chinese Temple and Museum in Marysville is an incredible place to see. The Museum of Northern California, Chinese Museum of Northern California is there. And also the Bok Kai Temple with the Bok Tai god inside of it. Very well preserved, a lot of things to see. And Oroville is amazing too. They have the largest collection of Chinese material from the gold rush period anywhere in the world. So I recommend those two places. They're in my film. So I just want to show a brief 5 minutes or so of the movie so you get a feel for it. And then I'll talk a little more and answer any questions that you may have. So here's Chinese Builders of Gold Mountain.
Hello, I'm Donna Dean, Chief Executive Officer.
Little word from the sponsor.
Senior Services. We offer programs that promote health and wellness for older adults and their caregivers. Find out more about us at accsv.org or call us at 916-394-6399. We're proud to present Chinese Builders of Gold Mountain. Now, enjoy the show.
It's on a golden voyage. The many scenes show the joys and tragedies of daily life. There is no bow or stern. The passengers can't tell which direction the ship is headed. Like life itself, it's an uncertain journey on an uncharted, unknown, unending sea. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 sent people from all over the world across oceans, mountains, rivers, and continents to pursue their dreams of finding vast riches. For the Chinese, it was first a dream, then a destination, finally a reality. The Chinese named their new home Gold Mountain. The journey would be about much more than the quest for gold. It became about self-determination and freedom, a story of battling racial violence and discriminatory laws. It became a story of cultures colliding sometimes harmonizing, sometimes fracturing into bitter rivalry. The Chinese built wondrous works that created modern California. Massive levees that protected cities and towns and allowed agriculture to flourish. Stupendous railroads that crossed mountain peaks no one thought passable. Caves that housed young America's challenge to the centuries-old dominance of the European winemakers. In building a new life in California, they created a trans-Pacific trade that transformed Hong Kong and chaotic San Francisco into world-class cities that forged a Pacific Rim trade that flourishes today. Temples rose from the California hills, housing rare artifacts from Asia and America.
Hello, I'm your host, Bill George. We're going to follow the voyagers on that mythical ship, and under the hard work, perseverance, and ingenuity of the Chinese builders of Gold Mountain.
This is Wen Zhuan, a Chinese artist of the 1850s. His self-portrait captures the potency of a generation undergoing immense changes in China. As young Chinese chafed under an empire that had ruled them for hundreds of years. While Wen Zhuan would not leave for California, thousands of young, ambitious men like him did.
This is the Gold Mountain dream, right? You go to Gold Mountain, you go back, you send money back, and there will be land and big houses. So that when you yourself return to China one day, you'll be able to live in these big houses.
The Chinese were mostly from Guangdong province in southern China, far from the throne in the Forbidden City. They went to Hong Kong, booked passage on ships there, and set sail for California. Disembarking in San Francisco, many quickly headed for Sacramento and Marysville in the 1850s, the second and third largest cities in the state. From there, they headed to the stony crevices of the Motherlode, places like Fiddletown, to try their luck in striking it rich. In her book Pacific Crossing, Dr. Elizabeth Sin of Hong Kong University looked into the lives of the Chinese who went to Gold Mountain.
Everybody was trying to get into California. It was really a very global phenomenon. Well, first of all, California was a place that people wanted to go to. So there was no duress. It was a desired destination. Either they could go on their own steam, or they were supported by their families, or they had enough social relationships to borrow money. So it was not something for people who were totally down and out.
Brian Tom is the director of the Chinese American Museum of Northern California. It's in Marysville, 40 miles north of Sacramento.
In my view, this was a singular event. It was not only in China, but throughout the whole world. People heard about this gold rush because it was so extraordinary. You had to remember the context in which you were dealing with here in California at that time. When gold was discovered, California wasn't even a state. It wouldn't become a state until 1850. But they were going through a transition period between Mexican rule and American rule. What that meant was that there was a lot of confusion and uncertainty about who owned the land. And so the saying came up that gold was free for the taking. And that was literally true because nobody knew who owned it. And that was an extremely unusual situation. It probably didn't exist and hasn't existed since that time. So this idea that there was this enormous gold farm in California excited the imagination of people from all over the world. It's the first time it's probably ever happened in world history that news like this impacted the whole world. So you had gold miners coming from Europe, you had them coming from South America, from the eastern part of the United States, as far away as Africa, Australia, islands in the Pacific, and also from Asia. But what is unique is that from Asia, even though it's the largest continent with the most number of people, the only folks that showed up were these people from Guangdong province in China. My family is from Marysville. My grandfather came to Marysville in 1851. He was a gold miner. mined gold for several years, struck it rich, joined with some others, and opened a store on First Street, which is half a block from this museum. And we kept that store operating for over 100 years. And it's one of the few buildings that are still standing in Marysville, Chinatown.
Marysville prospered during the gold rush era, becoming one of the largest cities in California. In 1857 alone, over $10 million in gold was shipped from Marysville to the U.S. Mint in San Francisco. Large ships could reach the town most of the year, and the river commerce created a city of almost 10,000 people at its peak. The museum is packed with fascinating vestiges of California history. Town's exhibit, Chinese American History in 10 Easy Steps, is augmented by display cases full of implements the Chinese used to carve gold from the California landscape. The museum is a few short blocks from the Bok Kai Temple. Walking through the elegant entrance onto the temple grounds is like stepping back into Gold Rush, California. The temple is fit snug against the levee at the confluence of the Feather and Yuba rivers, legendary watercourses that ferried the 49ers into the heart of the motherlode. Colorful murals, historic and rare, grace the white exterior temple walls. And a gracious host provides a warm welcome to visitors.
I'd like to welcome all of you to the Marysville Bok Kai Temple in Marysville, California.
Bok Kai is a Chinese god of water, and many believe that in a region that has been struck by massive floods, the temple in Marysville remained dry due to the powers of Bok Kai. The temple is a place of prayer and solemn reflection.
It really tells the story of this early Chinese settlement in America. It's the only active Chinese temple from the Gold Rush era. Some of the other Chinese temples in the state have become state parks or city parks. This one is still owned by the Chinese community, and it's still being used as a place of worship. It gives you a direct connection in terms of the belief system that people have. One of the things that these early Chinese pioneers didn't receive credit for was that they introduced two major religions into the North American continent. They brought Buddhism with them, and they brought Taoism with them. And Buddhism, in particular, has become one of the fastest growing religions on the North American continent.
The quiet is pierced when Chinatown leaps to life as people from around the world attend the Bok Kai Festival, which has been held annually since at least 1880. The temple is a true treasure, but despite Bok Kai's constant vigilance, the elements have taken a toll on the structure. The Marysville community has donated money, time, and materials to keep the temple functioning, but much restoration needs to be done to keep this icon of the Chinese pioneers vibrant and alive. The early Chinatowns in the Sierra Nevada foothills have mostly vanished. Just a few stone walls to remember those who contributed so much to California. From the big cities like Marysville, the Chinese joined other gold seekers in small towns like Fiddletown in Amador County. Fiddletown is a pleasant 47-mile drive from Sacramento over rolling hills past vineyards in an area that is quickly gaining an international reputation for fine wines. This is the largest collection of early Chinese buildings from a gold rush mining town. The Chinese buildings in Fiddletown include what is now the Chukey Museum, an 1855 Chinese herb store. It was constructed in the ages-old method of pouring mud, wet sand, and gravel into frames to form walls, a technique known as rammed earth construction. In 1860, there were 290 Chinese in town, almost 30% of the town population. Here and throughout the motherlode, gold seekers competed to find the biggest claims.
From the South Fork, Mr. O'Dwyer, who has just arrived from Coloma, informs us that on Friday last, 3 or 4 Chinese took out in that vicinity $300. Another man who was working on the north bank of the river, 3/4 miles from Coloma, took 3 pounds of dust after he had previously taken over 90 $1,900. Mr. O'Dwyer states that he was a Green Day, too.
What they did is they formed partnerships quickly because they would form partnerships by location. Maybe they came from the same village, by their surname, or by clans. And they were able to do this because they knew that they could trust the people within that group. And as a result of that, that gave them a tremendous competitive advantage when it went to mining gold. Most of the Western miners could start partnerships that had 1 or 2 people, or 3 at the most. Once it got above that, because the whole nature of Western society is individualism, they would run into difficulty. Whereas for a Chinese miner, they can submerge that individualism for the common good. And by working together, they were able to tackle bigger claims than many of the other miners could do working individually or in very small partnerships.
China, that is the name of a large settlement near Jackson, composed entirely of Celestials. They're a very quiet and industrious community and have done much towards unfolding the vast resources of this county. A large number of Chinese passed through McCollum the past week, en route from the camp above Maine. Additions from the late arrivals from Hong Kong are daily flocking into this county, and before long we may expect to see quite a town where Little China now stands.
In 1850 and 51, many gold seekers got rich by scooping up nuggets they found in fields or along rivers. But in 1852, the mining population exploded. Here's a look at the breakdown in Placer County, just east of Sacramento.
Census Bureau reporting Placer County population 10,784, 6,602 white males, 3,019 Chinese, 730 Indians, and 343 females. The rest of them is foreigners.
This is one of the most iconic images of the gold rush. It was taken in 1852 in the Sierra Nevada foothills near the town of Auburn, in Placer County, some 20 miles east of Sacramento. The picture is interpreted many ways. Does it show white and Chinese workers could coexist in the gold fields? Or is the mining trace in the middle a symbol of division? Backlash on white miners emerged in the 1850s. The Chinese were subjected to discriminatory taxes and fees. A foreign miner's tax as high as $4 per month. The income derived from the Chinese miners often accounted for more than 10% of the state's revenue. Heading north 25 miles or so up the Feather River is Oroville. Like the Marysville Temple, the Oroville Chinese Temple, built in 1863, is snuggled against the river levee. Bill Chan Wilcox's family has played an important part in preserving Oroville's temple complex, which today is run by the city.
They actually came for the gold. In Chinese, California was known as Gimsang, which is Gold Mountain. And you know, the stories back in China was that there were these mountains of gold, and Oroville happened to be one of the areas. And with the river running through it, it was easy for them to come to Oroville and settle in this area. They did go through the tailings, but there was a lot of gold in the tailings, because a lot of people, when they mined back in those days, would just take, you know, what was on the surface and wouldn't go through and take out the dust and the smaller particles of gold.
Even on the warmest summer days, you'll find a cool respite here in the courtyard of the Chinese Oroville Temple. But it's what's behind the walls that's really amazing. Artifacts dating back 150 years, some of the rarest objects in the history of the California Chinese. The main temple is the home for gods and a place of prayer for Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. The Chan Room is a Confucian temple and honors the Chan family's long involvement in the temple. You walk through the oval door and into the Moon Room, the home of the Yellow Buddha. The complex also houses the Old Council Room, a place where Oroville's Chinese officials kept records, paid bills, meted out justice, and even arranged to bury the dead.
complex is a replica of another important aspect of Chinese California life, the world of a Chinese merchant. These are the original lights, cabinets, cases, and artifacts in the Fong Li building.
The Fong Li Company was actually started by my great-grandfather, and that was his nickname, Fong Li. That's what they called him because that was the name of his business. And Fong Li actually means big profits.
You can spend hours in the temple's tapestry hall. You will greet it by a pair of enormous, floor-to-ceiling door guards.
The door guards were actually a donation to the temple complex, and it's believed that if you saw the door guards, you would not want to do anything that was bad. So it was to keep away the evil spirits. The Chinese were very adamant about evil spirits and not doing anything to allow them to take over.
So that's about all the time we have for the film portion of it. But if you'd like to see the rest of it, I do have it for sale, $10. So makes a nice little Christmas gift for somebody. And I also have my book that I wrote about the railroad, which also has a lot about the Chinese and the sites that you can see. So in that little clip that we showed, I hope that you could see that contrary to a lot of the historical narrative that we have, there was a lot of cooperation among people here in California at that time. You may have heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's people always say that to me. That didn't come until the 1880s, and that did not exclude the Chinese. People think that threw them out of the country. That's not what happened. It excluded the importation of Chinese to California at that time. But up until about that time, there was a lot of, I wouldn't say harmony, but at least people did get along, and a lot of people prospered. It did create a two-way trade between the United States and China, and many Chinese did get very wealthy, and many of the merchants got very wealthy. Later on in the film, I talk about the theaters that were set up. The Chinese would come in, and they would put on plays about life in China, and they'd always have special portions in the theater, usually the more expensive seats reserved for the American portion of the audience. And somebody asked me, did I get to Locke? Yes, I got to Locke, Fiddletown, Dutch Flat, the Sierra, so we got to about 10 or 12 places where the Chinese are prominent. So if nothing else, I hope that you will, on your own someday, take a trip up to Oroville and Marysville, see the temples. They are amazing to see in person. There's a lot of things to see there, as well as Dutch Flat's got a great museum. And as I said, the Donner Summit tunnels, which are just amazing. So with that, I would be happy to entertain any questions. Yes, sir? When was Locke created? Okay, so that's a very interesting story. So Locke is not a gold rush era Chinese town. Locke wasn't created until, let's see, what year are we now? We're 2015, so I was at their centennial event, so it was this year. So it was 1915. And Locke's a very interesting story. It's down in the Delta, probably most of you know where it is. An agricultural town, and was actually, I believe, given to the Chinese community by an American merchant farmer who wanted to develop it to get people to work in agriculture down there. Of course, I talk about this in the film too, they helped build the levees throughout that did reclaim the land for agriculture in the Delta area. Yes, sir?
That was agricultural focused.
That was, yes, Locke was very agriculturally focused. It was that and gambling, I understand, I'm told. Yes, sir?
Why did they all come from that one area in China?
Well, that's a good question. I believe that there's a couple reasons. One, that they were far from the central government in Peking, so they were in Beijing, I mean, so they were much more independent the further away you were from the capital. They were very rebellious. That's why they had the Tongs here in America. The other was that the people from the southern region of China had tended to be explorers, seafarers. They did sea trade. They went into Southeast Asia by boat, so they were more likely to travel and have a more adventurous spirit than other people. Very interesting story, though, and so I do hope you get up there. And yes, sir. One more.
Did you do any more research into the contention that the Chinese were the first to discover America in 1431?
I have not. The question is, have I done research into the contention that they discovered America in 1431? Was that there?
Was that Chinese junk?
Right, Chinese junk, yeah. I haven't, I don't really know that. I haven't really researched it, but knowing the capabilities of the ships that they had at the time, that if they got here, by that it was, you know, a miracle. So that's all I'll say, but I haven't really looked into that. I've read accounts of it, but actually the Chinese were in the United States and the East Coast right at the time of the Revolutionary War, but that was because of the relationships they had with the British and other things. So later on in the movie, I talk about a couple of Chinese merchants in California who were spoke very good English and were really the leaders of the political and cultural element in California, China, in the 1850s and 60s. Yes, sir.
How did the Chinese do after Pearl Harbor?
How did the Chinese do after Pearl Harbor? Well, that's part of the story too, I talk about a little bit, but if you look at the relations between the United States and China, okay, so again, I'm talking about a period here where, you know, there's no, early on, we're not the United States, it's this territory. So it goes from a very good relationship, I would say, in the beginning, where the Chinese came in. Then I talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is about 1880. Then there was xenophobia in the United States. There was, I think for economic reasons mainly, a lot of division, a lot of hostility towards the Chinese manifested in the popular press. And then about the 1930s, when the Japanese attack China, then some of you probably remember the great author Pearl Buck, who wrote beautiful novels, The Good Earth and other books. Then there's a tremendous outpouring of affection from the American people for the Chinese. You might remember Jimmy Doolittle's raiders landed in China and were saved by the Chinese. So then there's a good feeling. And then of course after the war with the mainland Chinese, or the People's Republic of China, there's bad feelings. And I talk about that in the film and get all the way to when Richard Nixon goes back to China and opens relationships. And one of the places also in the film we went to was Napa. And in Napa, the Chinese built wine caves in the 1870s and 1880s. Well, it turned out that when Nixon goes to China, somebody at the last minute in the American traveling party grabbed some wine off of a counter in Washington, D.C. in a liquor store, just grabs the wine. And it turns out that it was from Schramsberg Winery in Napa. They make the champagne, and that's the wine that they actually used to toast the new accord between the Americans and the Chinese when we normalized relations. So history has a funny way of doing things. Yes, sir?